In the summer of 1590, an English ship sailed once more toward the low, sandy islands that fringed the coast of what we now call North Carolina. The men on board were not strangers to this coast. They had seen it before, had sweated in its humid forests, had fought with its tangled waters, and they had left behind family, friends, and children on this soil. For 3 years, the settlers of Roanoke had been waiting. They had been promised supplies, relief, a return of their governor. Yet when the ships finally anchored and the boats rowed ashore, there was no cheering crowd, no sound of laughter, no smoke from hearth fires rising over the trees. The settlement lay silent. The wooden palisade was weathered but still standing. The houses inside had been carefully dismantled rather than destroyed. On one post, a single word had been carved in plain capital letters: Croatoan. On a nearby tree, 3 more letters: CRO. No bodies, no graves, no sign of a struggle, only absence. The entire colony, more than 100 men, women, and children, was gone. That moment has haunted American history ever since. The disappearance of the so-called Lost Colony is one of the oldest unsolved mysteries of the continent, a story that blends hope, desperation, empire, and tragedy. It has been retold in folklore, speculated on by scholars, turned into propaganda, and transformed into legend. Yet behind all the myths lies a real history, a chain of decisions made in the court of Elizabethan England, on the decks of fragile wooden ships, in the dense pine forests of the Carolina coast, and in the camps of Algonquian-speaking peoples who had lived on those shores for generations before the English ever dreamed of planting a flag there. To understand how an entire colony could vanish without a trace, we need to go back to the beginning of this unlikely enterprise and trace the steps that led men and women across the Atlantic into a world they scarcely understood. The dream of Roanoke did not spring up overnight. In the 16th century, England was a restless and ambitious kingdom, not yet the globe-spanning empire it would later become. Spain, flush with the riches of Mexico and Peru, had already carved out vast dominions in the New World, claiming lands with a mixture of military conquest, religious mission, and maritime power. France had established footholds along the St. Lawrence River, and Portuguese fleets carried home treasure from Brazil. England, by contrast, had little to show. Its sailors raided Spanish ships, and its traders scoured northern waters. But no enduring settlement had yet been planted across the ocean. The idea of founding a colony in the Americas carried both a strategic and a symbolic appeal. Strategically, an English base on the American coast could serve as a launching point for privateers harassing Spanish shipping and a resupply station for expeditions farther south. Symbolically, it offered the chance to prove that England too could stake a claim in this new world of possibilities. The man most associated with this vision was Sir Walter Raleigh, a courtier whose charm and ambition won the favour of Queen Elizabeth I as Raleigh never set foot in the Americas himself, but he became the architect and promoter of England's first colonial ventures. In 1584, under his patent, a reconnaissance mission was dispatched to explore the coast and report on its suitability. The scouts chose Roanoke Island, a low-lying strip of land tucked between the Barrier Islands and the mainland, as a promising site. They praised its fertile soil, abundant game, and sheltered waters. To Raleigh and his investors, it seemed the ideal location for England's first true settlement. Yet the challenges were immense. The English were intruding into a land already densely peopled by communities with their own alliances, rivalries, and ways of life. The coastal Algonquian tribes, such as the Secotan and Croatan, had long histories in these estuaries. To them, the English were neither gods nor demons, but potential allies or threats, outsiders who had to be judged by their behavior. Misunderstandings, mistranslations, and moments of violence would shape every stage of the colony's fragile existence. The first real attempt came in 1585, when a fleet led by Sir Richard Grenville landed on Roanoke with over 100 men. This group was meant to be the foundation of England's foothold, but it quickly ran into difficulties. Supplies proved inadequate, relations with the Secretans soured, and internal discipline frayed. The colonists built a small fort and endured, but after less than a year, they abandoned the settlement and returned to England with Sir Francis Drake. Their departure left behind not only the memory of conflict, but also the first hints that England's dream of a colony would be far harder to realise than Raleigh had promised. Still, the idea was not abandoned. In 1587, a new expedition set out under the leadership of John White, an artist and mapmaker who had travelled with the earlier voyages. This time, the colony was intended not as a temporary military outpost, but as a permanent settlement, complete with women and children. Around 115 settlers were chosen, including families who hoped to build new lives in America. White envisioned a community that could thrive, trading with native neighbours, cultivating crops, and serving as a model for future English ventures. Roanoke was to be the first seed of what Raleigh and his patrons imagined as Virginia, the name Elizabethans gave to the entire eastern seaboard in honour of their so-called Virgin Queen. Among the settlers was White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, who was soon to give birth to a child that would become a symbol of the colony's promise. In August 1587, she delivered a daughter, christened Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the dream of a transatlantic English community was real, embodied in the cry of a newborn whose very existence linked England and America. But even in those first weeks, difficulties mounted. Relations with local tribes were tense, supplies were already running low, and the colonists were painfully aware of their isolation. White resolved to return to England to gather reinforcements and much-needed provisions, a decision that would prove fateful. He left behind his family and his fellow settlers, promising to return as soon as possible. Events in Europe, however, intervened. England in 1588 faced the looming threat of the Spanish Armada, a vast fleet launched to invade and conquer. Every available ship was pressed into service to defend the realm. White found himself unable to return to Roanoke until 3 years had passed. By then, when he finally made his way back to the island, the world had changed, and the settlement he had left behind was gone. The silence of that deserted fort, the carved word on the tree, the absence of graves or bodies, would ignite centuries of speculation. Some would believe the settlers had been killed, others that they had been absorbed into native communities, still others that they had perished from hunger and disease in the wilderness. Archaeologists, historians, and amateur sleuths have searched ever since for traces of their fate, while the story has grown in the telling into one of America's foundational mysteries. Yet before we can weigh the theories, we must walk carefully through each stage of the story to understand not only what happened on Roanoke, but why it mattered so deeply to those who remembered it. The vanishing colony was not just a puzzle to be solved. It was a reflection of the hopes and fears of an age, a window into the collision of cultures, and the first in a long line of attempts to impose European order on a land that had its own history, its own people, and its own rhythms long before England dreamed of empire. To understand why England risked men and money on a distant and dangerous settlement, we have to look closely at the world of the late 16th century. Europe was gripped by fierce rivalries, religious divisions, and the lure of vast new wealth discovered across the Atlantic. Spain had become the most powerful monarchy in Christendom. Its conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires had flooded its coffers with silver and gold. Spanish ships crossed the seas heavily laden, carrying the treasures of the Americas back to Seville, and from there to fund armies, fortresses, and cathedrals. To English eyes, Spain's empire was both a warning and a temptation. The warning lay in its dominance. The temptation lay in the thought that perhaps England could seize a portion of the same fortune. Elizabeth the Fine had come to the throne in 1558 in a precarious position. Her kingdom was smaller, poorer, and militarily weaker than its rivals. France and Spain both loomed large, each Catholic, each threatening, each claiming the mantle of global power. England was still recovering from the religious upheavals that had torn it apart in the reigns of her father, her brother, and her sister. Elizabeth's legitimacy was contested by Catholic powers, who saw her as a heretic queen. If she wanted her kingdom to survive, she needed more than clever diplomacy. She needed new sources of wealth and prestige. It was in this climate that visions of the New World gained force. The idea was not entirely new. Since Columbus, stories of strange lands across the ocean had circulated through Europe. But for England, the opportunities remained largely theoretical until the middle of the 16th century, when the voyages of men like John Hawkins and Francis Drake began to show what could be gained by boldness. Hawkins pioneered the triangular trade in enslaved Africans, while Drake raided Spanish ports and ships, returning with cargoes of plunder that electrified the English court. These ventures demonstrated that the Atlantic was not Spain's private domain. It was a vast, contested space where daring could reap immense rewards. The most persuasive advocate for an English colony was Richard Hakluyt, a clergyman and geographer who spent much of his life compiling accounts of voyages. Hakluyt was less a sailor than a propagandist. He wrote with passionate conviction about the need for England to establish itself in the Americas. A colony, he argued, would provide raw materials, a market for English goods, and a base for further exploration. It would relieve population pressures at home by providing land for younger sons and the poor. It would serve as a bulwark against Spain, an outpost from which English ships could intercept treasure fleets. Above all, it would spread Protestant Christianity, countering the Catholic missions that Spain and France had planted. Hakluyt's works, especially his famous compendium, Principal Navigations, circulated among statesmen and merchants, shaping a vision of colonial destiny that was as much ideological as practical. Raleigh took up this vision with enthusiasm. The Queen granted him a charter in 1584, giving him the right to explore, colonize, and rule lands in North America not already claimed by a Christian monarch. The grant reflected Elizabeth's cautious but genuine interest. She provided her favour, and Raleigh provided the energy and financing. Raleigh's patent required that he establish a colony within 6 years or lose his rights, a clause that ensured urgency. With time ticking away, he dispatched his first reconnaissance voyage that very year. The explorers returned with glowing reports. They described islands covered with tall trees, fields ready for cultivation, waters full of fish, and soil rich for planting. They brought back samples of crops and glowing tales of a climate milder than England's. They also brought 2 native men, Manteo and Wanchese, who would be paraded at court as living proof of the new lands across the ocean. For Elizabeth and her courtiers, this was exotic and thrilling. For Raleigh, it was propaganda to secure further investment. Roanoke was presented not as a fragile experiment, but as the gateway to an English America. But propaganda could not erase the harsh realities. Colonies were expensive. Ships had to be built or hired, provisions purchased, and settlers recruited. Investors expected returns, not endless spending. Raleigh himself spent enormous sums, but he relied on a network of wealthy backers, each with their own hopes. Some dreamed of quick profits through mineral wealth. Others sought land for future generations. Still others were motivated by religion, eager to plant Protestant strongholds in defiance of Catholic Spain. This mix of motives often worked at cross purposes, creating tension between the need for patience and the hunger for immediate gain. The Elizabethan imagination was filled with contradictions about America. On one hand, it was depicted as a paradise, a fertile land waiting to be cultivated by industrious Englishmen. On the other hand, it was feared as a wilderness full of dangers, peopled by strangers whose customs were scarcely understood. Maps were dotted with sea monsters, forests with imagined beasts, rivers with speculative wealth. Few of the men who signed up for the early voyages had any clear idea of what awaited them. The Atlantic crossing was itself a trial. Weeks of cramped quarters, spoiled food, storms, and the constant threat of attack. For those who endured, the landfall on the Carolina coast was both a relief and a shock. The dense marshes, the humid air, the cries of unfamiliar birds, and the sudden encounters with Algonquian-speaking peoples all underscored that they were not in a paradise, but in a land that demanded adaptation. Religion coloured every aspect of the enterprise. Elizabeth's Protestant advisors saw the colony as part of a divine struggle. The Catholic monarchies of Europe were not only political rivals, but enemies of the true faith. Planting an English settlement in America meant planting Protestantism in a land they imagined as spiritually empty. The reality, of course, was far different. The native peoples had their own spiritual systems, their own sacred spaces, their own deep history. But to the Elizabethans, spreading their religion was both a duty and a justification for conquest. This conviction would echo throughout later centuries of colonization, but in the 1580s, it was still taking shape in the minds of Raleigh, Hakluyt, and their supporters. Another powerful current driving the dream was the hunger for new markets. England's wool trade had long been its economic backbone, but it was vulnerable to fluctuations in continental demand. Colonial promoters argued that America could be both a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of finished goods. Timber, pitch, tar, and naval stores could be shipped back to England, while manufactured cloth and tools could be exported. This vision was optimistic, perhaps unrealistic, but it provided an economic rationale that investors could grasp. Beyond economics and religion, there was prestige. Elizabeth's court was a theatre of spectacle, where courtiers vied for the Queen's attention with feats of daring, poetry, and flattery. A colony was not merely a financial gamble, but a performance of loyalty and ambition. For Raleigh, securing Elizabeth's favour was as important as securing America's shores. His sponsorship of voyages, his presentation of exotic goods, his tales of the New World were part of a larger dance of power at court. Success in America would elevate him. Failure could bring disgrace. The geopolitical stakes were immense. Spain regarded the entire continent as its sphere, backed by papal decrees and military force. English intrusion was a provocation. The proximity of Roanoke to Spanish routes raised the possibility of raids. For the settlers, this meant that survival depended not only on their ability to grow food and manage relations with neighbours, but also on avoiding the wrath of the world's strongest empire. The colony was, in this sense, as much a military outpost as a civilian settlement. The dream of planting a community of families was inseparable from the calculation of war. When we step back, the English vision of a new world was a patchwork of hope, fear, ambition, and fantasy. It combined genuine curiosity with ruthless opportunism. It was shaped by thinkers like Hakluyt, promoted by courtiers like Raleigh, and sanctioned by Elizabeth herself. But it rested on fragile foundations. Colonies required stability, continuity, and cooperation with the people already living on the land. Yet the English often arrived with assumptions that made cooperation difficult. They believed they could transplant their way of life wholesale, building towns, planting fields, and imposing their order, without fully grasping the environmental and cultural realities. This gap between vision and reality would prove decisive at Roanoke. The dream of the New World was not unique to England, but in the 1580s, it carried a special urgency. The clock of Raleigh's patent was ticking. The rivalry with Spain was sharpening. The promise of wealth was dazzling. The symbolism of a Protestant colony in America was irresistible. All of these pressures converged on one small island off the Carolina coast, where men and women would try to turn vision into reality. Their fate would show just how perilous that dream could be when confronted with hunger, isolation, and the unyielding landscape of a world they scarcely understood. And so, from the comfort of Elizabeth's glittering court and the pages of Hakluyt's persuasive writings, the dream was launched into the harsh reality of the Atlantic crossing. The next step was no longer theory, but practice. Ships filled with settlers and soldiers, supplies loaded in the hope they would last, and fragile agreements with native allies tested on the ground. What began as an idea in the minds of courtiers was about to meet the unforgiving test of survival in a land that cared little for England's ambitions. The vision of an English foothold in the Americas had been set in motion, but ideas on parchment and stirring speeches at court were not enough. It was time to act. Sir Walter Raleigh, despite never setting sail himself, became the driving force behind the first expeditions. His name was attached to them, his money invested, and his reputation placed on the line. He was both the architect and the promoter, and like many Elizabethan courtiers, he knew that success in such ventures could propel him to the very heights of influence. Failure, however, could just as easily reduce him to a cautionary tale. Raleigh's patent from Queen Elizabeth granted him sweeping authority over lands not yet claimed by another Christian monarch, but it also carried a ticking clock. He had 6 years to establish a settlement, or the rights would lapse. The first step was exploration. In 1584, he sent Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow across the Atlantic on a reconnaissance voyage. They made landfall on the Carolina coast, explored the sounds and islands, and returned with enthusiastic reports. They described an environment lush with resources, fertile soils, and friendly inhabitants. Whether this was their genuine impression or a carefully framed sales pitch to secure more investment is difficult to know, but the effect in England was dramatic. The explorers returned not only with stories, but with people. 2 Algonquian-speaking men, Manteo and Wanchese, travelled with them back to England. They were received at court, examined by scholars, and presented as living symbols of the New World. Manteo, from the Croatan tribe, appeared more willing to ally with the English, while Wanchese grew increasingly suspicious and resentful of his hosts. Their presence fueled curiosity and gave Raleigh tangible proof that his patent was worth pursuing. By bringing them across the ocean, The English also believed they were securing interpreters and cultural guides for future voyages. In reality, the gulf between the two worlds was far wider than most Elizabethans realized. On the strength of these reports, Raleigh organized a larger expedition in 1585. This was the first real attempt at a colony, though its character was more military outpost than civilian settlement. The fleet was commanded by Sir Richard Grenville, a tough, hot-tempered sea captain, while the day-to-day leadership on Roanoke itself fell to Ralph Lane, a soldier with experience in Ireland. Lane's background was telling. He had spent years in England's colonial wars against the Irish, campaigns marked by brutality, forced settlements, and scorched earth tactics. These experiences shaped his approach to the New World, where he would view alliances through the lens of suspicion and force. The 1585 expedition set out with 5 ships and about 600 men, though not all would remain in America. Their journey was long and difficult. They raided Spanish possessions in the Caribbean along the way, a reminder that England's ventures were as much about war as settlement. When they finally reached Roanoke, they chose to establish their base on the very island Amadas and Barlow had praised. The site was defensible, but not ideal for agriculture. Fresh water was limited, and the sandy soil was less fertile than imagined. Still, the English constructed a small fort and prepared to make their stand. At first, relations with the native peoples were cautiously cooperative. The English depended on the Secatan and their neighbours for food and local knowledge. Manteo acted as a mediator, using his ties to the Croatan to secure introductions and aid. But the English approach carried an assumption of superiority. They expected deference, demanded provisions, and often misunderstood local politics. The Algonquian world was not a blank slate. Villages had long histories, rivalries, and alliances. The arrival of a heavily armed group of foreign men threatened to upset this balance, and mistrust grew quickly. Supplies soon became a problem. The English had counted on resupply from England or on the generosity of local tribes. Neither proved reliable. Grenville returned to England, leaving Lane and his men behind. They hunted, fished, and traded, but shortages persisted. Lane grew impatient. His soldiers, trained for combat rather than farming, were ill-prepared to sustain themselves. Tensions with the Secatan escalated, especially as Lane suspected them of plotting against the English. In a fateful move, he struck first. In 1586, Lane invited Chief Wingina to a parley and then ambushed and killed him. The fragile trust collapsed. From then on, the English were increasingly isolated, cut off from the very people who might have helped them survive. The colony teetered on the edge of disaster. Morale was low, food scarce, and hostility rising. The men grew restless, and Lane himself recognized the danger. Their salvation came unexpectedly when Sir Francis Drake arrived off the coast in June 1586. Drake had been raiding Spanish ports in the Caribbean and stopped at Roanoke on his way home. He offered Lane and his men supplies and even reinforcements, but when storms disrupted the plan, the colonists seized the chance to abandon the island altogether. They boarded Drake's fleet and returned to England. The first attempt at Roanoke had ended in failure. Ironically, only days after they left, a resupply fleet dispatched by Grenville finally arrived at the deserted fort. Finding no settlers, Grenville left a small garrison of 15 men to hold England's claim before sailing home. Their fate remains uncertain, but by the time the next expedition arrived, they too had vanished. This grim pattern, hope, delay, abandonment, disappearance, was already beginning to take shape. Despite the failure, Raleigh did not abandon his patent. He needed to try again, this time with a different strategy. The 1585 colony had been too militarized, too dependent on force, and too poorly provisioned. The next attempt would need a civilian character, families instead of soldiers, a community that could take root. This was the genesis of the 1587 colony under John White, a settlement that would include women, children, and the promise of permanence. But the lessons of the first attempt, especially the fragility of supply lines and the dangers of antagonizing local tribes, hung over the enterprise. The English were learning that America would not easily yield to their ambitions, but they had not yet absorbed the full cost of their miscalculations. The first attempts at Roanoke had shown England the scale of the challenge. Ships could cross the Atlantic, forts could be built, alliances could be made, but sustaining life on the far shore was another matter. Men accustomed to short campaigns and raids struggled to adapt to the patience required for agriculture and coexistence. Their reliance on military logic poisoned relations that might have been partnerships. Yet in the flush of Elizabethan ambition, these failures were not enough to quench the dream. Instead, they set the stage for the second, more famous attempt, the one that would carry women and children, that would give birth to Virginia Dare, and that would ultimately vanish into silence, leaving only a carved word on a tree. The dream of England's first permanent colony did not begin with families and farms. It began as a military foothold, a test run designed to probe the coast, gather intelligence, and plant a flag. The expedition of 1585 was supposed to be the foundation stone of a new English America. Instead, it became a cautionary tale of ambition colliding with harsh realities. Later generations would remember the lost colony of 1587, but before that, there was another group who endured hunger, suspicion, and isolation on the same stretch of sandy coast. Their fate was not as mysterious, but it was no less telling. Sir Richard Grenville commanded the fleet that carried the expedition westward. Grenville was a cousin of Raleigh, a veteran sailor, and a man whose temper was legendary. With him sailed Ralph Lane, a soldier appointed governor of the new settlement. They were joined by over 100 men, most of them soldiers, along with scientists, artists, and artisans. Among them was Thomas Harriot, a mathematician and chronicler, and John White, the artist who would later lead the 1587 colony. Together they represented a blend of military muscle and intellectual curiosity, a mix that promised both defense and discovery. Their journey was long and troubled. Leaving Plymouth in April 1585, the fleet encountered storms and delays, then raided Spanish possessions in the Caribbean before finally reaching the Carolina coast in midsummer. Their arrival was marked by drama. One of Grenville's ships, the Tiger, ran aground and was nearly wrecked, destroying much of their food supply. It was a foretaste of the difficulties ahead. Still, they pressed on, establishing their base on Roanoke Island, chosen for its sheltered location between the barrier islands and the mainland. At first, optimism ran high. The fort they built was small but functional. Harriot and White documented the land, its plants, animals, and peoples with remarkable detail. White's watercolors captured images of Secatan villages, cornfields, and ceremonies, creating some of the earliest visual records of native life in North America. Harriot studied the language and customs, trying to learn enough to communicate. For a brief period, the settlement looked like it might succeed, a foothold of English order in a foreign land. But beneath the surface, tensions were already building. The English were dependent on the Secatan and neighbouring tribes for food. Their own supplies were insufficient, and their agricultural skills were untested in the Carolina climate. Mateo, the Croatan who had traveled to England, served as a mediator and ally, but even he could not erase the mistrust that grew between the settlers and their hosts. The English demanded corn during times when native stores were limited. They interpreted hesitation as hostility, and they often responded with threats. Ralph Lane's leadership was both disciplined and destructive. He was accustomed to command, having served in Ireland where England waged a brutal colonial war. He believed survival depended on demonstrating strength and feared that any sign of weakness would invite attack. This outlook made him suspicious of the Algonquian peoples. He demanded obedience where diplomacy might have sufficed, and when he sensed plots against the English, he was quick to strike. By the winter of 1585-1586, the colony's situation had deteriorated. Supplies ran short. Relations with the Secretary broke down after incidents of theft, misunderstandings, and mutual recriminations. Harriet later wrote that the natives began to view the English as dangerous sorcerers, capable of spreading disease and misfortune. The settlers, for their part, suspected conspiracies and feared ambush. In truth, the local peoples were themselves struggling to balance their own needs with the demands of their strange new neighbors. They had no reason to sacrifice their own survival for the sake of foreigners. The breaking point came in June 1586. Wingina, a Secretary leader who had once welcomed the English, now saw them as a threat. Lane grew convinced that Wingina was plotting against the colony. Rather than wait, Lane launched a preemptive strike. He invited Wingina to a parley, then attacked and killed him. The act destroyed any chance of rebuilding trust. What had begun as cautious cooperation collapsed into hostility. The English were now truly isolated, cut off from their only potential sources of food and aid. Morale plunged. The men were exhausted, hungry, and fearful. Their supplies were nearly gone, and their confidence in Lane's leadership was shaken. In this moment of crisis, salvation appeared on the horizon in the form of Sir Francis Drake. Fresh from his raids in the Caribbean, Drake anchored off the Carolina coast in June 1586. His arrival was both a blessing and a dilemma. He offered to provide the settlers with supplies and even reinforcements, but storms complicated the transfer. Facing uncertainty and fearing annihilation, Lane and his men made a fateful choice. They abandoned the colony and boarded Drake's ships for the return to England. Their departure was hasty, leaving behind equipment and hopes alike. When they sailed away, Roanoke was once again deserted. Ironically, only a few weeks later, a resupply fleet dispatched by Grenville arrived. Finding the settlement empty, Grenville searched, then decided to leave a small garrison of 15 men to maintain England's claim. These men's fate is obscure. By the time John White returned with a new group in 1587, the fort showed signs of attack, and the garrison was gone. Their disappearance foreshadowed the larger mystery to come. The 1585 expedition is often overshadowed by the later lost colony, but it was crucial in shaping the story. It demonstrated both the possibilities and the perils of English colonization. The English could cross the Atlantic, build a fort, and record the landscape in extraordinary detail. But they could not yet sustain themselves, manage relations with native peoples, or secure stable supplies. The arrogance of their leaders and the fragility of their logistics doomed the colony almost before it began. Thomas Harriot, reflecting afterward, wrote both honestly and optimistically about the experience. He acknowledged the hardships and the hostility. But he also argued that America offered immense potential if approached wisely. He praised the fertility of the land and the richness of its resources. His account was intended to encourage future ventures, to keep alive the dream that Roanoke had nearly extinguished. White's drawings, too, became part of this legacy, shaping European images of America for centuries to come. The lost expedition of 1585 was not erased from memory. Instead, it became a prelude, a warning, and a justification for trying again. Raleigh's patent was still in force, and his reputation still tied to the effort. The failure of Grenville and Lane was reinterpreted as a lesson rather than a final verdict. The next attempt would be different. It would not rely solely on soldiers, but include families. It would aim not just for survival, but for permanence. The English believed that by bringing women and children, they could create a true community, one that could take root and grow. John White, the artist who had observed the first colony, would now return as governor, bringing with him not only his wife and daughter, but the promise of a new generation. It was a bold plan, an attempt to transform a military outpost into a genuine settlement. But the shadow of the 1585 expedition hung over them. They knew how quickly alliances could crumble, how fast supplies could run out, and how easily ambition could turn to ruin on the edge of the American wilderness. When the first colony collapsed in 1586, some at court whispered that England was not ready for America. The news of Ralph Lane's harsh rule, the killing of Winginer, and the hasty evacuation under Drake made the whole project seem like a reckless gamble. Yet Sir Walter Raleigh could not afford to let the failure stand. His patent was still in force, his prestige still on the line, and the vision of an English America was too valuable to abandon. So Raleigh turned to a different kind of venture. Instead of another band of soldiers and sailors, he proposed a civilian settlement, one that would root itself through families, farms, and permanence. If the first attempt had been a military experiment, the second would be a social one. It was a gamble on community rather than conquest. For this new effort, Raleigh appointed John White as governor. White was not a soldier by profession. He was an artist and surveyor, a man who had travelled with the 1585 expedition and left behind invaluable sketches of the land and its people. He was not a leader in the mould of Grenville or Lane, but perhaps that was the point. White's vision was gentler, more domestic, more focused on settlement than warfare. By placing him in charge, Raleigh signalled that this time the colony was to be built not on intimidation, but on endurance. The choice of settlers reflected this shift. Around 115 men, women, and children were chosen, many of them from London and other towns, rather than the ranks of hardened soldiers. These were artisans, tradesmen, and families willing to risk a new life across the ocean. Among them were White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, Ananias. Eleanor was pregnant when she embarked, a detail that seemed almost symbolic. The birth of new life in the New World would embody the hope of permanence. The voyage began in May 1587. The fleet was commanded by Simon Fernandes, an experienced Portuguese pilot, notorious for his stubbornness and sometimes ruthless judgment. Fernandes had sailed on earlier voyages and knew the coast well. The plan was to settle not at Roanoke, but at Chesapeake Bay, a site believed to offer better soil, safer harbours, and more favourable conditions. Yet Fernandes, for reasons that remain debated, insisted on landing the colonists at Roanoke instead. Some say he was impatient, eager to turn to privateering. Others suggest the choice was forced by weather or danger at sea. Whatever his motives, the the decision proved fateful. When the settlers came ashore in July 1587, they found the remains of the earlier garrison left by Grenville. The fort was in ruins, overgrown and desolate. Bones and broken equipment suggested violence had claimed the 15 men left behind. It was an ominous welcome. Still, White and his people set about repairing and rebuilding, determined to make the place their own. They planted crops, raised simple houses, and tried to re-establish ties with local tribes. Manteo, the Croatan who had long sided with the English, once again became their bridge to the indigenous world. In the midst of these struggles, a moment of joy occurred. On August 18th, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter, christened Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the Americas, and her arrival was celebrated as a symbol of hope. To Raleigh and his backers, Virginia Dare's birth was propaganda as well as blessing. It suggested that England was not merely sending adventurers to raid and retreat, but planting families who could make the new world their home. In England, when the news eventually reached home, ballads and poems would be written about her, casting her as a figure of destiny. But beneath the symbolism, the settlers faced dire realities. Their food supplies were already running low. The soil at Roanoke was sandy and thin, better for cornfields maintained by the Secretan than for the wheat and barley the English preferred. Relations with local peoples were strained. Manteo's mediation offered some protection, but suspicion ran deep after the bloodshed of 1585-1586. The English sought peace, but they also carried their fears and prejudices with them. Trust was fragile, and survival was uncertain. It soon became clear that without resupply, the settlement could not last. John White faced a terrible choice. His fellow settlers urged him to sail back to England to secure provisions and reinforcements. White resisted, torn between his duty as governor and his love as father and grandfather. His daughter and newborn granddaughter were among the settlers. To leave them behind in a vulnerable outpost was agony, but to stay without food was to invite starvation. In the end, the colony convinced him that he must go. White reluctantly agreed, boarding a ship in late 1587 and promising to return as swiftly as possible. His departure marked the beginning of the colony's long isolation. For those left behind, there was no guarantee that aid would come. They had to endure on their own, surrounded by forests that could both provide and threaten, dependent on neighbours who might be friends or foes. We do not know exactly how they fared in those first months after White's departure. No diary survives, no record tells us of their daily struggles. We can only imagine their attempts to hunt, fish, and plant, their cautious approaches to nearby villages, their fear each time the wind rose or a figure appeared among the trees. For White, the voyage back to England was the start of another ordeal. Europe was in turmoil. Spain and England stood on the brink of war. The Great Armada loomed, and every available ship was seized for defence. White begged for passage back to his colony, but the seas were closed to him. He spent 3 long years in England, frustrated, desperate, and unable to return. He could only wonder what was happening across the ocean, whether his family was alive, whether the settlement had endured. The 1587 colony thus became a story of suspended hope. It was not yet the famous lost colony. At first, it was simply a struggling settlement awaiting relief. Its governor had gone for supplies, its people were hanging on, and its future was still unwritten. Yet those 3 years of silence transformed it. By the time White finally returned in 1590, the story had changed forever. When his ship anchored off the Carolina coast, White scanned the shoreline with anxious eyes. He had dreamed of reunion, of embracing his daughter and granddaughter, of finding the colony weathered but intact. Instead, he found emptiness. The fort was deserted, its houses dismantled. On one post, the word Croatoan was carved. On a tree nearby, the letters CRO. There were no graves, no signs of massacre, no bodies, just absence. The colonists of 1587 had become the vanished, the unaccounted for, the lost. Their fate was unknown, their story incomplete, their memory destined to haunt centuries of speculation. Virginia Dare, once a symbol of promise, became a ghostly emblem of disappearance. John White, broken-hearted, sailed away, never to see his family again. The colony he had founded passed into legend. But to understand what really happened, we cannot jump ahead to the mystery. We must sit with the 1587 settlers as they planted their crops, raised their children, and looked anxiously to the horizon for the sails of John White's returning ship. We must see their settlement not as a failure already written, but as a fragile experiment, still alive in those first months. They were ordinary men and women in extraordinary circumstances, caught between imperial ambition and the unforgiving realities of a strange land. Their vision was not conquest, but continuity, the hope of building homes where none had stood before. That vision, however, collided with storms, delays, and the vast forces of history that kept relief away. And so the 1587 colony became not only England's first attempt at a true settlement, but also America's oldest unsolved mystery. On a humid August morning in 1587, within the fragile walls of the Roanoke settlement, a cry rang out that no English ear had ever heard on American soil before. Eleanor Dare, daughter of Governor John White, had given birth to a child. She was named Virginia for the land itself, and Dare for her father. In that moment, the New World and the Old were joined not just by ships and soldiers, but by blood, flesh, and lineage. Virginia Dare was the first English child born in the Americas. For the settlers huddled in their makeshift homes, the event was more than a private joy. It was a public sign that the colony was not simply a camp, but a community. A baby meant continuity, the possibility of generations, the suggestion that Roanoke could become not just an experiment, but a lasting home. For a people who had left behind familiarity, kinship, and security, the birth of Virginia Dare was proof that new ties could be forged on this distant shore. The small infant, fragile and helpless, became a symbol of permanence amid uncertainty. John White, both governor and grandfather, must have felt the moment keenly. He had left his home in England to oversee this colony, and now his own blood was among its most vulnerable inhabitants. His sketches and observations from the earlier voyage had preserved the images of America, but now the colony itself carried his family's future. Eleanor Dare, his daughter, embodied that connection, and Virginia Dare, his granddaughter, was its living extension. The colony's survival was no longer only about Raleigh's patent or Elizabeth's glory. It was about whether this child and others like her would grow to adulthood in the new world. The choice of her name was deliberate. Virginia was a word already heavy with meaning. It had been used to describe England's claim to the vast eastern seaboard, honouring Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen. By naming the child Virginia, the colonists tied her identity to the land and to the monarch herself. She was a living dedication, a christened emblem of England's ambition. Every time her name was spoken, it echoed both the hope of settlement and the patronage of the crown. The birth, however, did not erase the realities facing the colony. Food was scarce, relations with neighboring peoples precarious, and the decision to remain at Roanoke rather than Chesapeake left many uneasy. A baby could inspire morale, but it also heightened fear. Infants demanded care, nourishment, and protection. They made communities more vulnerable. Virginia Dare's arrival meant that the settlers now carried not only their own survival, but also the survival of a child who represented more than themselves. In England, when word of the birth eventually crossed the Atlantic, Virginia Dare quickly became a figure of fascination. Reports framed her as a sign of divine approval, proof that God smiled upon the English venture. Ballads and poems celebrated her as the dawn of a new era. She was invoked in pamphlets urging continued support for colonization, held up as the first fruit of an English America. In truth, she was an ordinary infant, born into a precarious and short-lived community. But for a nation hungry for symbols, she was transformed into something larger, the embodiment of a future that had not yet come to pass. The fate of Virginia Dare became inseparable from the fate of the colony itself. When John White left in late 1587 to secure supplies, he left behind not only settlers, but his own daughter and granddaughter. His letters later expressed the agony of that decision. He promised to return quickly, yet circumstances in Europe kept him away for 3 long years. By the time he finally came back in 1590, the settlement was gone. No trace of Eleanor Dare, no trace of Virginia Dare, no trace of any of them. The name carved on the tree, Croatoan, was the only clue. It was this absence that turned Virginia Dare from a celebrated newborn into a legendary figure. She was the first English child born in the New World, and she became, in memory, the first lost child of America. Her life story is only days or weeks long, yet her afterlife stretches across centuries. Folklore grew around her name. In some tales, she survived by joining native communities, raised among them as a bridge between 2 worlds. In others, she became a ghostly figure, a pale doe wandering the forests, transformed by enchantment, forever searching for her people. These legends reflected both grief and fascination, an attempt to fill the silence left by the vanished colony. Virginia Dare's symbolic weight grew in later centuries. During the colonial revival of the 19th century, she was romanticized as a pure maiden of the wilderness, a mythic emblem of innocence lost. Writers cast her as a victim of native hostility, or as a noble figure who chose to embrace the native way of life. Both versions revealed more about the anxieties and fantasies of the storytellers than about the child herself. For Americans of the 1800s, Virginia Dare became a canvas on which to paint ideals of nationhood, race, and destiny. She was remembered not for who she was, but for what she represented. In North Carolina, her name endures in countless forms: counties, streets, schools, and monuments. She has been immortalized in operas, novels, and plays. Each retelling reshapes her story. Sometimes she's a symbol of loss, sometimes of resilience, sometimes of the merging of cultures, sometimes of their tragic clash. Her very lack of a concrete biography allows her to be endlessly reinterpreted. She is history's ghost child, forever present and forever absent. But to return to the moment of her birth is to strip away the layers of myth. In August 1587, she was simply a baby, held in her mother's arms in a wooden hut on a sandy island. Her cries mingled with the sounds of the forest and the sea. Around her stood settlers weary from their journey, fearful of the months ahead, but momentarily lifted by joy. Her grandfather perhaps sketched her tiny face. Her mother perhaps whispered to her of the world she had left behind. For a brief span, Virginia Dare was a child like any other, loved by her family, vulnerable to her surroundings, entirely dependent on the fragile settlement that cradled her. That fragility is what gives her story its enduring power. She represents not only birth, but the precariousness of beginnings. Just as the colony itself was an experiment that might succeed or fail, so too her life was a beginning without guarantee. The English hoped she marked the start of a line of generations in America. Instead, she marked the fragility of that hope. When the colony disappeared, her name became shorthand for all that was lost. Not just lives, but possibilities, futures, and the dream of an English America that would have to wait until Jamestown, decades later. Virginia Dare remains both the most real and the most unreal figure of Roanoke. Real, because we know she was born, baptized, and named. Unreal, because beyond those facts her life is a blank, filled only by speculation, folklore, and longing. She stands at the intersection of history and myth, where the absence of evidence creates fertile ground for imagination. Her story is not her own, but the story of all who vanished at Roanoke, condensed into the image of a child whose fate is forever unknown. And so, in the fragile days of the colony, the settlers pinned their hopes on her as proof that they could belong. They saw in her birth the promise that England could root itself in American soil. But history had other plans. As John White sailed away, torn between duty and family, he left behind not only a community, but his granddaughter, whose name would outlast them all. The colony's struggle was now entwined with hers, and the silence that followed their disappearance ensured that Virginia Dare would be remembered, not for the life she lived, but for the mystery that consumed her. When the colonists of 1587 repaired the ruined fort at Roanoke and tried to establish themselves anew, they were not entering an empty land. They had stepped into a living landscape where communities already farmed, fished, hunted, and fought long before an English ship ever touched the shore. The Secotans and their neighbours had generations of experience in these tidal rivers and barrier islands. To them, the English were newcomers, unpredictable strangers with weapons of iron and a hunger for food they had not earned. The fate of the colony depended less on the fortifications of wood they built than on the fragile web of relationships they wove with the peoples around them. The first attempt in 1585 had already poisoned many of those ties. Ralph Lane's killing of Wingina had left bitterness among the Secotans, who saw clearly that the English could turn violent when threatened or even suspected of treachery. The survivors of that earlier conflict carried the memory into the second colony. The English hoped to mend relations, but they also carried with them the same assumptions: that food and aid could be demanded, that their presence was justified, that misunderstanding was more the natives' fault than their own. This mixture of need and arrogance was dangerous, and it soon became clear that mistrust was never far from the surface. Manteo remained the one constant ally. Born among the Croatan, he had travelled to England and back, and he saw in the English both an opportunity and a threat. His people lived on a smaller island, somewhat apart from the Secotans and other powerful groups, and alliance with the newcomers offered potential leverage. Manteo served as interpreter, mediator, and advocate, guiding the colonists through the complicated landscape of alliances. To the English, he seemed a loyal friend. To his neighbours, he was a man who had tied his fortunes to outsiders. The Secotans and related groups like the Dasamongaponke were not passive figures in the story. They watched the colonists carefully, judged their strength, and weighed how much to tolerate. They knew the English brought dangerous weapons and strange goods. They also knew these strangers demanded food during seasons when every kernel of corn counted. For a community that depended on careful planning, sharing large stores with outsiders threatened survival. Each request from the English tested patience. Each refusal from the Secretary stoked suspicion. John White tried to balance diplomacy with firmness. He sent parties to visit neighboring villages, offering trade and friendship. Sometimes gifts were exchanged, and for brief moments it seemed alliances could hold. But one misunderstanding, one theft, one clash in the woods could undo months of cautious work. The colonists were strangers to native politics. They assumed that one leader spoke for an entire people, that promises bound all equally, that trust could be established with words alone. In reality, native communities were complex, their leadership fluid, their decisions collective. What seemed like an agreement to the English might have been a courtesy, not a binding contract. What seemed like betrayal to the English might have been another group acting independently. The settlers' desperation only heightened tensions. Food shortages were constant. They begged for corn, sometimes paying with trade goods, sometimes demanding when generosity was thin. Each time they leaned on their neighbors, they revealed weakness, and weakness bred contempt. For peoples accustomed to testing the strength of allies, the colonists' reliance made them look fragile. Yet the English had weapons that could not be ignored: firearms, steel, and ships. This paradox made every interaction unstable. The settlers were both needy and dangerous, weak and threatening. One of the sharpest clashes came with the Dasamongaponke. Stories recorded later tell of an attack in which one of their men was shot and killed after a dispute. The English justified it as retaliation for theft or insult. The natives saw it as proof that the newcomers could not be trusted. The blood spill deepened divisions, reinforcing memories of earlier violence under Lane. Even if some villages remained friendly, the pattern was clear. The English had arrived with families and promises, but they still carried the edge of suspicion that made peace fragile. Manteo's loyalty was tested in these tensions. The colonists leaned heavily on him, and he proved his value again and again. He guided them to safe harbors, explained native words, and pleaded for cooperation. At times, he also acted as their enforcer. When relations with the Dasamongaponke broke down, Manteo sided openly with the colonists, leading to reprisals that left several natives dead. The English saw his actions as proof of fidelity, but to others, it branded him as a collaborator, tied to outsiders who brought conflict rather than harmony. Manteo's position was dangerous, caught between his kin and his allies. The English recognized his importance and tried to honor him. In August 1587, shortly after the birth of Virginia Dare, they baptized Manteo as a Christian, the first native in the region formally converted by the colony. White gave him the title Lord of Roanoke and Dasamongaponke, a designation that meant little in Algonquian terms but symbolized to the English loyalty and reward. It was a ceremony heavy with symbolism. The colony had a native ally baptized into their faith, a sign they believed God blessed their enterprise. Yet the act also revealed their blindness. By giving titles and imagining authority where it did not exist, they misread the dynamics of native politics. Manteo could be their friend, but he could not deliver entire peoples into obedience. Every day, the settlers faced reminders that they were intruders. They heard drums in the distance, saw smoke from villages beyond their sight, and knew that their presence was being weighed by eyes they could not see. Each trip outside the fort risked encounter. Some returned with baskets of corn and goodwill. Others returned with wounds or not at all. The settlers wrote letters back to England describing both cooperation and fear, never certain which would prevail. The memory of Lane's violence lingered like a shadow. For the Sekatan, the killing of Wingina was not forgotten. For the colonists, the fear of reprisal was constant. Each side watched the other for signs of treachery. Trust never settled long enough to harden into peace. For the women of the colony, including Eleanor Dare, the tension must have been particularly heavy. They cared for children, tended fires, and tried to build homes, all while surrounded by uncertainty. They depended on their husbands and fathers to negotiate peace, yet they lived with the consequences of every clash. A cry in the night, a figure in the forest, the snap of a twig could spark panic. They had come to plant families, but the soil itself seemed to reject permanence. The settlers' relationship with the tribes around them was not a single story of hostility. There were moments of genuine exchange, of learning words, sharing food, and marveling at one another's ways. White's sketches of ceremonies and dances, Harriet's descriptions of crops and tools, testify to curiosity as well as conflict. But those moments were fragile, constantly undermined by hunger, fear, and cultural misunderstanding. A single gunshot could erase months of fragile goodwill. By the time John White prepared to leave for England, the colony's ties with its neighbours were strained but not broken. Manteo remained loyal, but the Sokotan and others were wary. The colonists had food enough for the moment, but they knew the winter ahead would test them. White left behind a settlement balanced on a knife's edge, dependent on uncertain alliances, vulnerable to hostility, and marked by the memory of bloodshed. This was the reality into which Virginia Dare was born, a world of fragile hope overshadowed by tension. For the settlers, survival meant not only enduring hunger and storms, but navigating a human landscape that was as complex as the forests and rivers around them. They were not alone, and their fate would be shaped as much by their relationships with the Sekatan and other tribes as by the supplies they carried from England. The tension was not yet open war, but it was a constant presence, a reminder that the colony's future hung on threads too easily broken. From the beginning, the Roanoke settlers knew they were vulnerable. They had sailed across the ocean with stores of food and seed, but no amount of packing could sustain a community indefinitely. The plan had always depended on renewal, more supplies sent from England, more ships bringing goods and reinforcements. Yet when John White prepared to leave in the late summer of 1587, he did so with the knowledge that every passing week without aid would test his people. Their isolation was complete, and the thin line of survival grew thinner with each day. The colony's location made the problem worse. Roanoke Island was not fertile in the way promoters had described in London. Its sandy soil resisted English grain crops, and the colonists had little experience growing the maize that was the staple of their neighbours. Fishing was possible, but the settlers were not seasoned fishermen, and the shallow waters often proved treacherous. Hunting offered deer, small game, and birds, but numbers were limited, and competition with local tribes was inevitable. The colony could not feed itself without outside help or steady cooperation with nearby villages. The settlers had brought seed for European crops, wheat, barley, peas, but these did not thrive in the climate and soil. The summer heat was oppressive, the rainfall unpredictable, and the English did not yet understand the cycles of planting and harvest native to the region. Corn, beans, and squash grew abundantly in native fields, but to adopt those methods required humility and trust. The colonists were often too proud or too desperate to learn properly, and their requests for food could quickly turn into demands. As stores dwindled, anxiety mounted. The settlers faced the harsh reality that their very survival depended on the goodwill of the Secatan and Croatan. Some villages traded willingly, offering baskets of corn in exchange for English goods like metal tools or cloth. Others hesitated, wary of giving away precious food when their own communities needed it. The English could not always understand the limits of these exchanges. What they saw as stinginess was, from the native perspective, careful planning for winter. Misunderstandings deepened mistrust. Inside the palisade, daily life revolved around stretching what little food remained. Rations were reduced. Mothers fed children first. Men went on hunting parties that returned with too little to share widely. Fishing nets tore, traps failed, and every meal became a reminder of scarcity. Hunger sharpened tempers. The promise of a new life in America felt like a cruel illusion, replaced by the gnawing emptiness of stomachs. Isolation compounded the crisis. The settlers had no way of knowing what was happening in England. They did not know of the Armada looming across the Channel, nor that their homeland was consumed with defending itself from Spain. They did not know that John White was pleading for ships in vain, caught in the politics of war and delay. For them, the ocean horizon was a constant question mark. Each day they scanned the waters, hoping to see sails. Each day they saw only waves. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical. Families wondered whether White would ever return. Some doubted his promise. Others reassured themselves that he must be on his way, that rescue would appear before hunger became famine. But the months dragged on, and doubt crept into every conversation. Rumors circulated of plots, of betrayals, of native plans to drive them out. Fear was a constant companion, and fear made trust nearly impossible. Manteo remained the one steady ally, but even he could not erase the isolation. His Croatan kin offered some measure of refuge, and the colonists looked to them for both protection and food. Yet Manteo was only one man, his influence limited. The larger network of Secatan and other Algonquian groups remained suspicious, and some openly hostile. The settlers, cut off from England and unable to fully integrate with their neighbours, occupied a space that was neither secure nor sustainable. Each small conflict deepened the crisis. A theft of food, whether by a hungry colonist or a desperate native, could spiral into violence. A failed harvest meant long months of scarcity. A death by disease or accident was another reminder of fragility. For women like Eleanor Dare, raising infants and caring for children in such conditions must have been an almost unbearable burden. Every cough could be a warning, every cry of hunger a wound deeper than any musket ball. The settlers had been promised renewal and aid. They had imagined ships bringing barrels of grain, tools, and new settlers. Instead, the long silence of the sea stretched endlessly before them. Isolation was no longer just a condition, it was a sentence. They were left to endure with what little they had, while the great machinery of European politics turned on matters far removed from their suffering. For some, the isolation may have inspired thoughts of leaving Roanoke altogether. The Croatoan Island, home to Manteo's people, offered friendlier shores and perhaps more stable alliances. Others may have contemplated moving inland, seeking communities where they might be absorbed. The settlers were English, but hunger makes pragmatists of all. To survive, they might have chosen assimilation, abandoning their fort for the security of native villages. Whether such decisions were made deliberately or forced upon them by desperation, the possibility of dispersal grew stronger with each passing season of scarcity. Isolation also cut the settlers off from the symbolic lifeline of England itself. They had been told they carried Elizabeth's favour, that they represented the glory of Protestant expansion, that they were pioneers of empire. But on Roanoke, those lofty ideals withered into daily drudgery. No queen stood beside them when the corn bins were empty. No royal favour filled their cooking pots. The crown's protection was an ocean away, and in its place was only silence. The colony's leaders tried to maintain morale. They prayed together, held fast to routines, and reassured one another that rescue would come. But faith can only stretch so far when confronted with emptiness. The sound of stomachs rumbling in the night, the thin faces of children, the weary eyes of men who had given up hope. These were the realities inside the walls of Roanoke. As the seasons turned, the crisis deepened. Winter brought cold winds and barren fields. Summer brought heat and swarms of insects. Each cycle was endured, not conquered. The settlers' isolation became their defining condition. They were suspended between two worlds, too far from England to be rescued, too estranged from their neighbours to be sustained, too fragile to stand alone. And still they waited for John White. They waited through storms, through hunger, through whispers of betrayal. They waited for sails that never appeared. Their isolation was not just geographical, but existential. They had been promised a place in history, but history had left them stranded, forgotten in the clash of empires. This was the crisis at the heart of Roanoke, a colony cut off, dependent on food it could not grow, alliances it could not secure, and promises it could not see fulfilled. Every decision they made, every step beyond the palisade, every kernel of corn they ate was weighed against the unknown future, and still the horizon remained empty. By the end of the summer of 1587, the fragile optimism that had greeted the colony's first days was giving way to sober recognition. The settlers were in trouble. Their crops had not yielded enough. Trade with surrounding peoples was uncertain, sometimes warm, sometimes hostile. Their stores from England were dwindling, and the ships that had brought them could not remain. It became painfully clear that without new supplies from home, the colony would not survive another year. The burden of decision fell upon John White. He had accepted the role of governor reluctantly, chosen more for his reputation as a fair-minded man than for any military skill. His background as an artist, not a soldier, had marked him as a gentler leader, one whose vision was less about conquest and more about building a community. But leadership demanded choices, and now the hardest one lay before him. Whether to remain with his people or return across the ocean to secure the help they desperately needed. The settlers debated the issue among themselves. Some urged him to stay. They argued that the presence of their governor gave them cohesion and morale, that his absence would weaken their standing with native groups. Others pressed him to go. They knew that without provisions from England, they would starve. White could negotiate more effectively than any other among them, for he had Raleigh's trust and courtly connections. If anyone could persuade investors and captains to sail, it was him. White's heart was torn. His own daughter Eleanor was among the settlers, her infant child, Virginia Dare, barely a month old. To leave them behind was to abandon his blood to the uncertainties of hunger, disease, and violence. Few choices in history carry such a cruel weight. He could stay, share their hardships, and possibly perish with them. Or he could leave, promising to return with aid, while knowing that the ocean could delay him for months or even years. The colony chose for him. In council, they urged White to sail. They made their case that his departure was their only hope, that they would endure in his absence if he brought them relief. The vote was clear. White would go. But even with consensus, the decision felt like a wound. He had to face his daughter and granddaughter to explain why he was leaving, to assure them that he would return. We cannot know the words exchanged in those final days, but the anguish must have been palpable. Ellen Adair, newly a mother in a precarious settlement, must have clung to her father, desperate for reassurance. White himself would later write of his sorrow, though his accounts remained restrained, filtered through the language of duty. The raw grief of leaving his family could only be imagined between the lines. The voyage home began in late August. White boarded one of the departing ships, heavy with the responsibility of returning swiftly. He left behind a colony numbering over 100 souls, including his daughter, his son-in-law, and his granddaughter. They stood on the shore as the ships pulled away, the cries of children mingling with the crash of waves. The sight of England's sails shrinking on the horizon must have felt like a final severing. From that moment onward, the colony was alone. For White, the crossing back to England was filled with urgency. He believed he could quickly gather provisions and return before the colony's situation grew desperate. Yet he underestimated the forces shaping Europe at that very moment. England was bracing for war. Philip II of Spain was preparing his armada, a vast fleet intended to crush Elizabeth's kingdom. Every available ship in England was being pressed into service for defence. The idea of diverting vessels to resupply a distant colony seemed absurd to those responsible for the survival of the nation. White's pleas ran into a wall of necessity. Raleigh remained supportive, but even his influence could not conjure ships out of thin air. White found himself entangled in delays, promises made and broken, hopes raised and dashed. Each month that passed in England was another month of silence for those at Roanoke. White sent letters, sought investors, tried to persuade captains, but the war consumed everything. He must have lain awake at night imagining the colony starving, his daughter watching her child fade, his own name cursed for leaving. Yet he was powerless. The sea that separated him from them was not just physical, but political. An ocean of priorities in which Roanoke was small and fragile. Back on Roanoke, the settlers faced the isolation alone. They had watched their governor depart with promises of return. They may have reassured themselves that he would be back before winter. But winter came, then summer again, then another winter, and still no ship appeared on the horizon. Each passing season eroded confidence. Did White die at sea? Had England forgotten them? Were they truly abandoned? The longer White remained in England, the heavier the silence became. In time, he did secure passage, only to have his fleet attacked by privateers, scattering the effort. When at last, after 3 long years, he returned in 1590, the colony was gone. His decision to leave, though born of necessity, became the pivot of the entire mystery. Had he stayed, he might have shared their fate. By leaving, he preserved his life, but lost them all. In hindsight, it is tempting to judge White harshly. Critics have said he abandoned his people, that a true leader would have remained. But to place ourselves in his position is to understand the agony. He faced an impossible choice: stay and watch them starve, or go and risk never seeing them again. His decision reflected both duty and hope, but history turned it into tragedy. The departure of John White left the Roanoke colony suspended in uncertainty, their leader gone, their supplies thin, their future unknown. They were left to fend for themselves, reliant on their own ingenuity and whatever alliances they could maintain. For 3 years, they endured without contact, their story unwritten until White returned to find only silence and a carved word on a tree. The mystery of Roanoke begins here, in this decision. Without White's departure, the colony's fate might have been more fully recorded. With it, they passed into the shadows of history. His choice set the stage for the most enduring enigma of early America, the disappearance that still captures imaginations centuries later. When John White sailed away from Roanoke in August of 1587, he believed he would return quickly. The colony's need was urgent, but not yet desperate, and he carried with him the conviction that England would recognize the importance of sustaining its first real foothold in America. But timing is everything in history, and White's departure coincided with one of the most perilous moments England had ever faced. Within a year, the kingdom was bracing itself for the arrival of a force so vast and threatening that it seemed nothing else could matter. That force was the Spanish Armada. By the mid-1580s, relations between England and Spain had deteriorated beyond repair. Elizabeth I had sheltered Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, sanctioned privateers like Francis Drake to plunder Spanish treasure fleets, and openly supported ventures like Raleigh's colonization efforts, which were viewed in Madrid as outright encroachment. For King Philip II of Spain, England was not just a nuisance, but a heretical threat to Catholic dominance. He began to prepare a fleet, an invincible armada of ships that would carry an army across the Channel, crush Elizabeth's forces, and restore Catholic rule to England. The plan was grand and audacious. Spain would gather a fleet of over 130 ships, some of the largest war galleons in Europe, armed with thousands of men, cannon, and supplies. They would sail north from Spain, rendezvous with an army in the Netherlands, and together land on English soil. England, small and militarily weaker, braced for invasion. The very survival of Elizabeth's crown was at stake. In such a climate, colonial ventures shrank in importance. Every ship, every sailor, every piece of iron was needed for defense. White's pleas for a relief expedition were met with sympathy, but little action. Captains who might have ferried supplies to America were conscripted for war. Investors who might have funded another voyage held back, uncertain whether England itself would survive the year. The settlers on Roanoke were not forgotten entirely, but they were relegated to the background of a much larger struggle. White attempted to circumvent the delays. In 1588, he managed to join a small private venture, hoping to slip across the Atlantic despite the crisis. But privateering ships were more interested in raiding Spanish possessions than in delivering food to a struggling colony. When they encountered stronger Spanish vessels, White's expedition was attacked, his supplies scattered, and his hopes dashed. He was forced to return to England empty-handed. For the settlers waiting across the sea, this meant another year of silence. Meanwhile, the Armada sailed. In July 1588, Spanish ships appeared in the Channel, their sails filling the horizon, their banners proclaiming Catholic crusade. The English fleet, smaller but more maneuverable, harassed them relentlessly. Fireships were sent into Spanish ranks at Calais, scattering the formation. Storms battered the retreat around Scotland and Ireland. By the time the Armada limped home, half its ships were gone, and Philip's dream of conquest had collapsed. The threat had been averted, but at immense cost. England had poured its energy and resources into survival. Colonization seemed almost trivial against the backdrop of national deliverance. For White, the victory brought no immediate relief. The kingdom celebrated, poets sang of Elizabeth's triumph, and Protestant Europe rejoiced. But across the Atlantic, his daughter and granddaughter still waited. The victory that preserved England also prolonged the colony's isolation. Only when the crisis had passed did attention turn again to ventures abroad, and by then 3 years had slipped by. This delay is perhaps the most crucial factor in the Roanoke mystery. Colonies could endure hardship for a season, perhaps 2 if relief came. But 3 years without contact was too much. In those years, the settlers had to fend entirely for themselves. They had no shipments of tools or seed, no reinforcements, no letters from home. Their link to England was severed at the very moment they most needed it. The irony is sharp. England's survival against the Armada made possible its later empire, including Jamestown and the colonies that would eventually stretch across the continent. But for Roanoke, that same struggle was fatal. The settlers had the misfortune of being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, sacrificed to the larger needs of empire. Their disappearance was not just the result of hunger or hostility, but of geopolitics, the consequence of a small community overshadowed by the clash of giants. When White finally secured another passage in 1590, the war was still not fully over, but the immediate threat had receded enough for ships to sail. Even then, his expedition was more focused on privateering than relief. The vessels that carried him across the Atlantic raided Spanish islands in the Caribbean before turning north to Roanoke. White must have been torn between frustration and hope, forced to watch precious weeks wasted on plunder, while his family languished in uncertainty. By the time he reached the Carolina coast, it had been 3 years since he had said goodbye. The settlers could not have known why their governor failed to return. From their perspective, the silence must have seemed like abandonment. Perhaps they imagined storms had sunk his ship. Perhaps they believed England had turned its back on them. The truth, that their homeland had been consumed by the fight for its own existence, was beyond their sight. For them, all that mattered was the horizon, empty day after day. The Spanish Armada and the fatal delay it caused ensured that when White finally arrived, there was no colony to save. The word carved on the tree, the empty fort, the dismantled houses, all spoke to a story already ended. Whatever decisions the colonists made during those 3 silent years were decisions made in the shadow of isolation imposed by European war. Without that delay, perhaps White might have returned in time to sustain them, to relocate them, to prevent the disappearance that haunts history. With it, the colony slipped into legend. The story of Roanoke is often told as though it were a local tragedy, a matter of poor planning, hostile neighbors, and fragile supply lines. But it was also a global story, shaped by the rivalry of empires and the sweep of history. The settlers were pawns in a game they could not see, caught between Spain's armadas and Elizabeth's survival. Their lives were sacrificed to the defense of a nation that, in saving itself, lost them. And so, while England celebrated its triumph over the Armada, the shores of Roanoke lay silent. The fires that might have signaled life to a passing ship were extinguished. The voices of children were hushed. The colony story, suspended in hope when White departed, was now swallowed by absence. The fatal delay had done its work, and the mystery of Roanoke was sealed. The summer of 1590 was heavy with expectation when John White once again crossed the Atlantic. 3 long years had passed since he had last seen Roanoke. 3 years since he had embraced his daughter Eleanor and her infant child Virginia Dare. 3 years since he had promised to return with relief. Those years had been filled not with swift rescue, but with delays, setbacks, and the consuming struggle of England's war with Spain. Now, finally, he was back. Each wave that struck the hull of his ship carried him closer to the settlement he had left behind. He had imagined this moment endlessly, how the colonists might greet him, how his granddaughter might toddle toward him, how the fort might stand repaired and thriving. But as his fleet neared the Carolina coast, reality began to unfold in ways he could not have foreseen. The voyage itself had not been simple. White traveled aboard ships more interested in privateering than in rescue. The captains who carried him had raided Spanish outposts in the Caribbean before reluctantly turning north toward Roanoke. White endured the detours in agony, knowing that every day spent plundering meant another day of uncertainty for the colony. But he could do nothing. He was a passenger, not a commander, carried along by the priorities of men whose fortunes lay in captured cargo, rather than in delivering relief to a forgotten outpost. When at last they reached the Outer Banks in mid-August, White's heart must have pounded with both hope and dread. He knew the seas here were treacherous, the shoals deadly, but beyond them lay Roanoke, the settlement that had consumed his life. On the night of August 15th, he and a small party made their first attempt to land. They lit a trumpet call and fired muskets into the air, signals meant to alert the colonists. They listened for a reply, perhaps a gunshot, a shout, a fire kindled in answer. Nothing came. The night remained silent except for the crash of surf. The following morning, August 16th, they tried again, battling the dangerous breakers. Their boat capsized in the surf, nearly drowning several men and destroying much of White's personal gear. He lost boxes of clothing, maps, and instruments, a bitter blow for a man whose identity was bound up in his careful sketches and records. Yet even amid the loss, his thoughts must have turned instantly to his family. Did they see him from the shore? Were they running to the beach even now? It was not until August 18th, ironically the third birthday of Virginia Dare, that White and his party finally managed to make landfall. The date, which should have been a day of celebration, became instead a day of shock and sorrow. As they approached the settlement, they saw no familiar figures, no gathering of colonists waiting to welcome them. The fort was still standing, its palisade weathered but intact. The houses inside, however, had been dismantled, not destroyed, not burned, but carefully taken down. The village was deserted. White searched desperately for signs. On a post at the entrance to the fort, he found a single word carved deeply into the wood: Croatoan. On a nearby tree, 3 letters had been cut: C-R-O. These were not random marks, but deliberate messages, left as if to guide him. White remembered the plan made years earlier. If the colonists were forced to move, they were to carve the name of their destination into a tree or post. If they were under duress, they were to carve a cross above the name. Here was the word, clear and unmistakable: Croatoan. But there was no cross. White clung to this detail as a lifeline. It suggested that the colonists had not been destroyed, but had relocated, perhaps to Croatoan Island, the home of Manteo and his people, 50 miles south. It was plausible. The Croatan had always been friendlier than the Secatan, and moving there might have offered safety, food, and alliance. White's spirits rose. His family might still live. Virginia Dare might even now be playing in a village by the sea. Yet questions abounded. Why had they dismantled their houses? Why leave no message beyond the single word? If they had thrived, why had they not returned to meet White's signals? The silence of the settlement was overwhelming. White scoured the ground for graves, bones, or signs of struggle. He found none. The absence of bodies seemed to confirm that no massacre had taken place. Instead, the colony had vanished in an orderly way, leaving only the carved word as a clue. White urged his companions to sail for Croatoan at once. His hopes fixated on the idea that Eleanor, Ananias, and Virginia were waiting for him there. But fate intervened again. Storms gathered, battering the coast and threatening to wreck the ships. Supplies were running low, tempers frayed, and the captains refused to risk their vessels on the shallow, dangerous approach to Croatoan. White pleaded, but they would not relent. The fleet turned away. He was forced to leave without ever verifying the fate of his people. The agony of that moment cannot be overstated. After 3 years of separation, 3 years of delay and longing, John White had finally returned, only to find absence. He had come within sight of an answer, only to have storms and stubborn captains snatch it away. His daughter, his granddaughter, his colony, all lost beyond his reach. He would never return again. White spent the rest of his life in England, haunted by the mystery. He never knew whether his family survived, whether Virginia Dare grew to adulthood, whether the colonists found refuge or perished. He carried only the memory of the carved word, the tantalizing suggestion of survival denied by circumstance. The scene White discovered in 1590 is the pivot upon which the legend of Roanoke turns. Without the carved word, the colony might have been remembered simply as another failed attempt, like so many others in the age of exploration. But with it, the story became a riddle. The word Croatoan was both clue and mystery, pointing to a destination but leaving the outcome unknown. It transformed Roanoke from a tale of hardship into America's oldest unsolved disappearance. Historians have debated endlessly what the carving meant. Some argue it was straightforward. The colonists moved to Croatoan and were absorbed by the Croatan people. Others suggest it was a false trail, or that the colonists scattered to multiple destinations, leaving only a partial clue. The absence of evidence ensures that speculation continues. But for John White in 1590, the meaning was simpler. It was hope dashed by storms, preserved only in memory. For the English public, the report of White's discovery stirred both fascination and frustration. They longed for resolution, but the story ended in silence. No further expeditions were launched to search Croatoan or beyond, at least not with the urgency required. Raleigh, entangled in politics and eventually imprisoned, abandoned the colony's survivors to time. The dream of Roanoke faded, replaced by new efforts in Jamestown years later. Yet the image of the carved word endured, etched into the imagination as deeply as it had been etched into the wood. In the centuries that followed, the word Croatoan became a symbol of absence itself, a cipher for mysteries unsolved. Writers, poets, and later novelists seized on it. It appeared in folklore, in ghost stories, even in the modern imagination, where it stands for vanishing without explanation. That single carving, weathered away long ago, became the most famous inscription in early American history. For John White, however, it was not a literary device or a symbol. It was the last message from his family. He must have replayed it in his mind countless times, wondering whether Eleanor had held the knife that cut the letters, whether Ananias had helped dismantle the houses, whether Virginia Dare had toddled beside them as they set off for Croatoan. The word was both presence and absence, proof that they had lived, and proof that he had lost them. Thus, the return of 1590 gave the world its enduring mystery. A colony vanished, leaving behind no graves, no ruins, no clear sign of its fate. Only a carved word on a tree, a governor's grief, and a silence that has lasted for more than 4 centuries. When John White returned in 1590 and found only the word Croatoan carved into a post, it was both a clue and an invitation. It suggested that the colonists had not been annihilated, but had moved, perhaps willingly, to the island inhabited by Manteo's people. Of all the explanations that have been offered for the disappearance of the colony, this one remains both the most plausible and the most humane. That the English survivors assimilated into nearby native tribes, forging new lives far from the ruined fort. The theory of assimilation has its roots in the very alliances forged during the colony's fragile beginnings. The Croatan, a smaller Algonquian-speaking group living on an island south of Roanoke, had long been friendlier than their more powerful neighbours, the Secotan and Dasamongeponke. Manteo, the Croatan who had travelled to England and returned, had been baptized into Christianity and given an English title. He had every reason to aid the settlers, and his people had less to lose and more to gain from alliance with the newcomers. If the colony's survival depended on native friendship, Croatoan Island was the obvious refuge. There are strong reasons to believe that some, perhaps many, of the colonists did exactly that. The dismantling of the houses at Roanoke suggested an orderly departure rather than a violent end. There were no bodies, no signs of battle or massacre. The carving of Croatoan was a deliberate act, following the instructions White had left before sailing in 1587. The absence of a distress mark, the cross that would have signalled danger, suggested the colonists had left willingly, or at least not under immediate duress. These details point toward relocation, and the Croatan were the logical hosts. Oral traditions among native peoples add weight to the theory. Stories collected in later centuries among tribes in North Carolina and Virginia describe the presence of Europeans, or people of mixed heritage, living among them. Some accounts speak of grey-eyed children, others of villages where English words or customs were remembered. The Lumbee of North Carolina in particular have long claimed descent from the lost colonists. Linguists in the 19th century noted unusual words in the Lumbee dialect that seemed to echo Elizabethan English. Such evidence is not definitive, but it is suggestive, pointing to cultural blending that might trace back to Roanoke. The assimilation theory also fits the logic of survival. The colonists of 1587 were not soldiers hardened to hardship. They were families, men, women, and children who needed food, shelter, and protection. To remain at Roanoke without resupply was impossible. To move inland without allies was suicidal. But to join with a friendly tribe offered a chance, however precarious, of endurance. For Ellen Adair and her infant Virginia, the prospect of safety among the Croatan would have been far preferable to waiting for relief that never came. Yet assimilation would not have been simple. The cultural gulf was immense. The settlers brought with them not only their language and religion, but their sense of superiority. To submit themselves to native authority would have required humility, and humility was in short supply among Elizabethan colonists. But desperation breeds pragmatism. Hunger and isolation can soften pride, and necessity may have driven the settlers to accept roles within a native community, however diminished those roles may have seemed in their eyes. It is also possible that assimilation was partial rather than total. Some groups of settlers may have gone to the Croatan, others perhaps inland to tribes along the Chowan or Roanoke rivers. Reports in the early 17th century hint at sightings of English captives or descendants scattered across different communities. John Smith of Jamestown heard tales of men in European dress living among the Tuscarora. William Strachey recorded stories of villages where English-style houses stood, built by survivors or their children. None of these accounts can be proven, but they echo one another enough to suggest that fragments of the colony persisted, dispersed among different tribes. Archaeological evidence, though limited, has also offered tantalizing hints. Excavations on Hatteras Island, believed to be part of the Croatan domain, have uncovered European artifacts dating to the late 16th century, including pieces of metal and tools that seem to have been repurposed by native peoples. Some of these objects could have come from trade, but others suggest longer, closer contact. A gun barrel cut down and reshaped into a tool, for example, speaks of adaptation, the blending of European materials into native life. Such finds support the possibility that at least some colonists lived and died among the Croatan. If assimilation occurred, what might it have looked like? For women and children, integration into native households may have been swift. Marriage alliances were a common way of strengthening ties between groups. Eleanor Dare, as a woman of high symbolic value, might have been given as a wife within the tribe, securing protection for her daughter. Other women may have married native men, their children growing up bilingual, bicultural, carrying English blood but Algonquian identity. For men, the process may have been harder. Warriors trained to command may have struggled to accept subordinate roles. Some may have adapted, others may have resisted, perhaps even dying in conflicts born of pride and difference. Over time, the memory of their origins would have faded. Children born of English mothers or fathers and native partners would have grown up knowing only the rhythms of village life. The names of Elizabeth and Raleigh would have meant little beside the names of rivers and clans. Yet fragments might have persisted, words, songs, gestures that carried the faint echo of an English beginning. When Jamestown settlers later reported meeting natives with blue or grey eyes, they may have been glimpsing the genetic trace of Roanoke. The assimilation theory also explains why the colonists left no permanent mark as a distinct English community. Absorbed into larger tribes, their identity dissolved. They did not survive as Roanoke, but as part of something older and deeper. Their disappearance was, in this sense, not total annihilation, but transformation. They ceased to be English colonists and became something else, the first of many who would be woven into the tapestry of America's indigenous and settler histories. This possibility carries both comfort and melancholy. Comfort because it suggests that the colonists did not all perish in misery, that some found new lives, new families, and perhaps even contentment. Melancholy because it means that their English identity, the very reason they had come, was erased, swallowed into cultures that England itself would later seek to destroy. The irony is sharp. The first English settlement may have survived only by ceasing to be English. The lack of definitive evidence keeps the theory in the realm of probability rather than certainty. The word on the tree, the oral traditions, the scattered artifacts, all are pieces of a puzzle, but the full picture remains elusive. Skeptics argue that such evidence could be coincidence or invention, that the colonists may have perished despite leaving hopeful signs. Yet for many historians, assimilation remains the most likely outcome. It fits the circumstances, the logic of survival, and the fragmentary traces that have come down to us. For John White, the thought that his family might have lived among the Croatan was surely both hope and torment. To imagine his daughter and granddaughter alive but beyond his reach, raising new generations in a world he could not enter, must have haunted him. He never saw Croatoan Island. He never confirmed what the carving suggested. He died with the mystery unresolved, like all who came after him. In the centuries since, the idea of assimilation has carried its own symbolic weight. Some have celebrated it as a story of unity, the first blending of English and native lives. Others have lamented it as a story of loss, the disappearance of identity into alien customs. For modern descendants like the Lumbee, it is a source of pride, a claim to deep roots that bridge two worlds. For others, it remains an unprovable legend, tantalizing but incomplete. What is certain is that the theory of assimilation reflects both the fragility and resilience of human communities. Faced with extinction, people adapt. They seek food, shelter, and family where they can find them. The settlers of Roanoke, stranded and forgotten, may have done just that. They may have laid aside the trappings of England and entered a new life, one that left few written records but lived on in blood and memory. And so the word carved into the post in 1590, Croatoan, remains the clearest voice the colonists left behind. It points toward friendship, refuge, and survival. It is a reminder that even in disappearance, there may have been continuity. That in the heart of mystery, there may have been lives lived long after the fort at Roanoke fell silent. The word carved into the post at Roanoke suggested that the colonists had moved willingly to Croatoan, but the truth may have been far more grim. For centuries, scholars and storytellers alike have wrestled with another set of possibilities: that the colony did not survive at all, that its people were consumed by tragedy in its rawest forms, violence at the hands of hostile neighbors, the slow death of starvation, or even betrayal from within. The first theory, and the one most often imagined in lurid detail, is that the colonists fell victim to conflict with surrounding tribes. Relations with the Sekatan and Dasamonga had been poisonous ever since Ralph Lane's bloody ambush of Wengina in 1586. That killing had shattered trust, and even though Manteo worked to mend ties, memories of English treachery lingered. By the time the 1587 colony arrived, suspicion already simmered. White's reports speak of cold receptions and outright hostility in some villages. One can easily imagine a moment when tensions erupted into open violence. If the colonists begged too often for corn, if they demanded food in a lean year, if they trespassed on fields or hunting grounds, conflict would not have been long in coming. English firearms were formidable but limited. Muskets were slow to reload, powder ran out, and numbers mattered. 100 colonists, including women and children, could not withstand sustained assault by determined warriors. Some may have fallen in ambush, others in a siege of the fort. The absence of bodies at Roanoke is often raised against this theory, but it is not conclusive. Victors may have carried away captives, or bodies may have been buried elsewhere. The careful dismantling of the houses could even suggest that survivors abandoned the site after defeat, joining other groups under duress. A second possibility, less dramatic but no less lethal, is starvation. The settlers' reliance on outside aid was always a gamble. White's departure left them with only what they could grow, hunt, or trade. But Roanoke's soil was thin, its waters unpredictable, its seasons harsh. Without knowledge of local planting cycles, English grains withered. Without reliable trade, corn supplies dwindled. Archaeological evidence from other colonies shows how quickly malnutrition set in when food ran short. Starvation rarely comes suddenly. It creeps in with weakness, disease, and despair. Children suffer first, then the elderly, until the entire community is reduced to skeletal endurance. In this scenario, the colonists may have attempted to disperse, seeking food inland or along the coast. Some might have joined native villages not as equals but as dependents, trading labor for sustenance. Others may have perished in the woods, too weak to reach safety. White's carved word, Croatoan, could have been a desperate signal, not of triumph but of last resort, telling rescuers where survivors had gone in search of food. If White had reached the island, perhaps he would have found a handful of gaunt settlers clinging to life. Instead, storms forced him away, and the truth slipped forever beyond reach. The third, darker possibility is betrayal. Colonies under stress often fracture. Disputes over leadership, resources, and survival can tear communities apart. White himself was not universally loved. Some settlers doubted his fitness for command, and disputes had already erupted during the voyage. Once he left, rivalries may have deepened. If factions arose, some might have chosen to abandon the fort, seeking their own fate among friendlier tribes. Others may have resisted, leading to violence within the colony itself. Betrayal need not mean deliberate treachery. It could mean desertion, self-preservation at the expense of the group. Families might have split, friends turned on one another, the unity of Roanoke dissolving into fragments. There is also the haunting possibility of betrayal from outside. The Spanish, aware of England's ventures, had scouted the Carolina coast in the 1580s, hoping to crush any settlement before it could take root. Spanish records hint at expeditions probing the area, though none confirm direct contact with Roanoke. Still, it is conceivable that Spanish forces, intent on denying England a foothold, destroyed the colony or carried survivors away. If so, they left no record of triumph, and the silence of their archives is itself suspicious. Yet the idea of European betrayal, though less popular than tales of native conflict, cannot be dismissed outright. These theories of tragedy often overlap. Starvation could have driven colonists to seek food from reluctant neighbors, sparking conflict. Conflict could have left survivors who were then forced to assimilate. Betrayal from within could have splintered the group, with some finding safety and others perishing. The neat categories we imagine may not reflect the messy reality of survival. What is clear is that the colony faced immense pressures, any one of which could have proved fatal. Later reports from Jamestown settlers lend credence to these darker possibilities. In 1607 and after, colonists there heard rumors from native informants of a group of Europeans who had once lived among the tribes, but had been slaughtered by more hostile powers. William Strachey wrote in 1612 that the lost colonists had been killed at the instigation of a chief fearful of English expansion. John Smith, too, heard stories of villages where survivors had once lived before being destroyed. These accounts are second-hand, filtered through translation and political agendas, but they suggest that the fate of Roanoke was remembered in native oral history as a story of violence rather than peaceful absorption. Still, tragedy leaves fewer artifacts than survival. The silence of archaeology, the absence of graves, weapons, or burned ruins, cuts both ways. It could mean no massacre occurred. It could also mean that time and tide erased the traces. On the sandy, shifting soils of the Outer Banks, 4 centuries can swallow evidence with ease. For Eleanor Dare and her daughter, each tragic scenario takes on a personal dimension. Did Eleanor die of hunger, holding her child as her strength failed? Did she fall in an ambush, Virginia clutched in her arms? Or did she live long enough to see her community betray itself, torn apart by desperation? The tragedy of Roanoke is not abstract. It is human, measured in lives lost, in choices forced by circumstances beyond control. The theories of tragedy also reflect broader anxieties about colonization itself. For English audiences, tales of massacre or betrayal reinforced the dangers of venturing into the New World. For later American audiences, they became stories of innocence lost, of pioneers swallowed by a wilderness, both natural and human. The uncertainty allows each generation to project its fears. Starvation for some, violence for others, treachery for yet others. In every case, the tragedy lies in the absence of closure, the inability to say definitively what happened. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these theories is that they require no imagination beyond the obvious. Colonies did fail. People did starve. Conflicts with native groups were frequent, and betrayal within communities was common. Nothing extraordinary need have happened for Roanoke to end in tragedy. The extraordinary lies only in the silence that followed, the lack of witnesses, the absence of survivors to tell the tale. And yet, even within these dark possibilities, there remains room for ambiguity. Tragedy may have claimed some, assimilation others. The colony's story may not have one ending but many, scattered across the coastal plain and remembered only in fragments. Theories of tragedy confront us with the harsh truth that the Roanoke experiment was fragile from the start, a venture too ambitious for its means, too isolated for its survival. Whether by conflict, starvation, or betrayal, its failure was always likely. What makes it unforgettable is that we will never know exactly how that failure unfolded. The mystery of Roanoke has endured not only because of the silence of history, but because of the hunger to fill that silence with evidence. For centuries, the fate of the lost colony lived in rumor, oral tradition, and speculation. But in time, archaeologists, historians, and local enthusiasts began to sift the soil itself, searching for physical traces that might confirm or deny the theories of assimilation, tragedy, or dispersal. In the shifting sands of the Outer Banks and the clay soils inland, they hoped to uncover the story the colonists could not tell. The first attempts at archaeological inquiry were not the professional digs of modern science, but the work of antiquarians and amateurs in the 19th century. Local lore around Roanoke Island was rich with stories of hidden graves, strange stones, and European artifacts uncovered by farmers. These accounts were often exaggerated, shaped by the desire to connect the land to the famous mystery. Still, they planted the idea that somewhere beneath the ground, answers might be waiting. By the early 20th century, more systematic efforts began. Excavations at the site of Fort Raleigh sought to locate the precise footprint of the 1585 and 1587 settlements. Archaeologists uncovered earthworks and post holes that suggested the outlines of the English fortification. Artifacts such as gunflints, nails, and ceramics confirmed an Elizabethan presence. These finds offered proof that the stories of the colony were grounded in reality, that the English had indeed built and lived on Roanoke. But they also underscored the absence of evidence for what happened afterward. The colony's disappearance left behind no mass graves, no burned ruins, no cache of hidden documents. The mystery endured. The search expanded beyond Roanoke itself. If the colonists had moved, as the word Croatoan suggested, then evidence might be found on Hatteras Island, home to the Croatan people. Excavations there uncovered a scatter of European objects, a signet ring, fragments of metal, pieces of pottery. Some of these items were clearly of English origin, dating to the 16th century. Their presence raised tantalizing possibilities. Were these goods traded, or were they the belongings of colonists who had joined the Croatan? The line between trade and residence is difficult to draw, but the finds kept alive the assimilation theory. Inland, too, clues emerged. Archaeological digs in the Chowan River basin revealed European ceramics and weapon fragments that seemed older than the Jamestown era. Some researchers argued these could be traces of Roanoke survivors who had moved inland, integrating with tribes along the rivers. Skeptics countered that such artifacts could have been carried later by trade, passed from hand to hand across generations. The evidence, while suggestive, was not conclusive. One of the most intriguing modern developments came not from the soil, but from a map. In the early 2010s, scholars studying a map drawn by John White noticed patches of paper glued over certain areas. When examined with advanced imaging, one patch revealed the faint outline of a fort symbol at the confluence of two rivers far inland from Roanoke. This hidden fort marked on White's map suggested that the colonists may have intended to move inland from the beginning, or at least had scouted such a location. Archaeologists dubbed the area Site X and began to explore it for traces of English presence. At Site X, in Bertie County, North Carolina, archaeologists unearthed fragments of pottery that matched 16th century English types, including Surrey, Hampshire borderware, a style common in Elizabethan households. Other artifacts, such as a copper aglet, a clothing tip, reinforced the possibility of English settlement. Again, the finds were few and scattered, but their context, deep inland, far from known trade routes, hinted that they may indeed represent relocated colonists. If so, then the story of Roanoke did not end on the island, but continued along the rivers, woven into native communities and hidden from European eyes. Even as archaeology revealed new fragments, it also sparked debates. Each discovery invited competing interpretations. Was a ring on Hatteras proof of colonist survival, or simply the spoils of later trade? Were ceramics at Site X the belongings of Roanoke settlers, or goods carried there decades later by natives trading with Jamestown? The evidence was never clear-cut, and the desire for certainty often outpaced the ability to provide it. The most infamous case of disputed evidence came in the form of the so-called Dare Stones. Beginning in the 1930s, a series of inscribed stones were discovered in Georgia and the Carolinas, claiming to tell the fate of Eleanor Dare and the colony. The first stone described Eleanor's sorrow, the deaths of many settlers, and the survival of only a few who travelled inland. For a time, scholars debated its authenticity, and the stone even appeared in prominent publications. But as more stones emerged, conveniently found by treasure hunters eager for attention, suspicion mounted. Most are now considered forgeries, though a small minority of researchers still defend the possibility that the first stone may be genuine. The controversy reflects both the hunger for evidence and the ease with which hoaxes can exploit that hunger. Modern archaeology has become more cautious, more precise, yet the results remain fragmentary. Soil analysis, chemical testing, and remote sensing have refined the search, but Roanoke resists closure. Artifacts are sparse, scattered, and ambiguous. What has emerged instead is a mosaic of possibilities. Evidence of English goods among the Croatan, fragments inland at Site X, scattered signs of presence beyond the island. Together, they suggest that the colonists did not vanish in a single event, but dispersed, leaving traces too faint to resolve fully. The archaeological hunt has also highlighted the importance of native perspectives. For too long, the story of Roanoke was told only from the English viewpoint, as a tale of loss and mystery. But archaeology has shown how native communities absorbed, traded, and transformed European goods. What appear as clues to Roanoke may equally be evidence of indigenous adaptation. A shard of pottery, a metal tool, a gun fragment. These objects tell not only of English survival, but of native resilience, the ability to take what was foreign and make it useful. In this sense, the archaeological record reinforces the broader lesson of Roanoke, that the colony's fate cannot be separated from the peoples who already lived there. Whether through assimilation, conflict, or dispersal, the colonists' story was absorbed into a larger tapestry, one in which European presence was just another thread. Archaeology offers glimpses of that tapestry, but never the whole. The hunt for Roanoke's traces continues today. Excavations at Fort Raleigh, Hatteras, and Site X remain active, each new season promising discoveries that might tip the balance of theory. Scholars debate, enthusiasts speculate, tourists wander the reconstructed fort at Roanoke Island Festival Park. The mystery endures because the evidence is always just enough to tantalize, never enough to conclude. For those who long for closure, this can be frustrating. But for others, it is precisely the ambiguity that makes Roanoke compelling. Each artifact, each soil sample, each inscription, whether genuine or forged, adds another layer to the story. The colonists remain lost not only in history but in archaeology, their presence scattered like fragments of pottery waiting to be pieced together. And so the hunt continues, spades in the earth, eyes on the map, minds turning over each clue. The soil yields its secrets slowly, and perhaps it will never yield them all. But even in fragments, archaeology has ensured that the lost colony is not entirely lost. Their traces remain, scattered across islands and rivers, carved into wood and clay, whispering from the past that they were here, that their story is not silence, but survival and struggle remembered in pieces. By the 20th century, the lost colony had become more than a mystery of history. It had become a legend of America itself, a story retold in schoolbooks, dramatized in pageants, and debated in scholarly journals. The carved word Croatoan still stood as the central enigma, but people longed for more, for some tangible record left behind by the colonists themselves. It was into this climate of fascination that the Dare Stones emerged, promising not just clues, but a direct voice from Eleanor Dare, the daughter of John White and mother of Virginia Dare. The first stone appeared in 1937, discovered by a tourist named Louis Hammond along the Chowan River in North Carolina. Roughly inscribed on its surface was an extraordinary message. It claimed to be written by Eleanor Dare herself, telling of the colonists' suffering, the death of her husband Ananias and many others, and her own survival with a dwindling group. The inscription, if genuine, would have been nothing less than the Rosetta Stone of Roanoke, the first-hand account from the vanished settlers. The stone read in halting, archaic English, with phrasing that seemed at once authentic and strangely theatrical. It described hunger, hostility from surrounding peoples, and the loss of loved ones. Most strikingly, it spoke of Virginia Dare's death, recounting the sorrow of a mother who'd buried her child in an unknown land. For those who longed for closure, the stone was electrifying. If true, it offered the final chapter to the colony's story, penned in grief on the hardest canvas available. The stone quickly drew attention. Scholars at Emory University in Atlanta examined it and, at least initially, deemed it plausible. The language resembled Elizabethan English. The wear on the stone seemed natural, and no obvious signs of forgery were apparent. Newspapers trumpeted the discovery. The public, already enthralled by the romance of the lost colony, devoured the story. Here, at last, was Eleanor Dare's voice, reaching across centuries, speaking of tragedy and survival in words etched by her own hand. But the story did not end with one stone. Over the next 2 years, dozens more surfaced, mostly in Georgia. These later stones expanded the narrative dramatically. They claimed to trace the journey of survivors who had fled far inland, recording deaths along the way, betrayals, and final settlements. Some even described Eleanor herself living for years in the wilderness, marrying again, and leaving behind descendants. What began as a poignant artifact grew into an epic saga carved across a series of rocks, telling the story of the lost colony from 1587 to Eleanor's death in the 1590s. The stones were acquired and displayed by Roanoke College in Georgia, which saw them as treasures that would place the institution at the center of historical discovery. They were heralded as one of the greatest finds in American archaeology. For a moment, it seemed that the mystery of Roanoke had been solved not by spade and soil, but by words inscribed in stone. Yet from the beginning, doubts whispered. The sudden flood of stones after the first seemed suspicious. Their discovery always seemed conveniently timed, often by people who stood to profit from publicity or payment. The language, though superficially archaic, sometimes rang false to experts in Elizabethan usage. Certain spellings and idioms appeared more like the invention of a modern imitator than the genuine record of a 16th century English woman. And the locations stretched credulity. Could Eleanor Dare and her companions really have journeyed hundreds of miles into Georgia, carving their tale on stone after stone as they went? By 1941, skepticism had hardened into exposure. Scholars conducted more rigorous tests, examining tool marks, patina, and linguistic patterns. The verdict was damning. The later stones, at least, were almost certainly forgeries, created in the 1930s to exploit public fascination with Roanoke. Their inscriptions showed anachronisms in grammar and vocabulary. The wear on their surfaces did not match the centuries they supposedly endured. The supposed discoverers were revealed to have shady motives. The entire saga was branded a hoax. The exposure was a humiliation for Roanoke College and for those who had championed the stones. What had been trumpeted as America's greatest archaeological find was recast as one of its greatest frauds. The public, once enthralled, turned skeptical. The Dare stones were ridiculed in the press, and the reputation of those who had defended them was tarnished. The lost colony mystery, instead of being solved, had been deepened by deception. Yet even in disgrace, the Dare stones never entirely disappeared. A small minority of researchers continued to defend the possibility that the first stone, the one Hammond found in 1937, might be genuine. Its language seemed more convincing than the later fabrications, and its discovery predated the frenzy that followed. If it stood alone, they argued, it might still represent a real message from Eleanor Dare. But this view has never regained wide support. For most historians and archaeologists, the Dare stones remain a cautionary tale about the dangers of wishful thinking and the ease with which a mystery can be exploited. The hoax reflected not only individual deception, but cultural hunger. The 1930s were a time of economic depression, when Americans sought stories of resilience and identity. The lost colony, with its themes of struggle and disappearance, spoke to that hunger. The idea of Eleanor Dare speaking from the past, telling of her grief and survival, offered both romance and tragedy. It was too good not to believe, and for a time, belief carried the day. In the larger story of Roanoke, the Dare stones symbolize the human need for closure. When evidence is absent, imagination rushes to fill the void. Sometimes that imagination produces folklore, like the tale of Virginia Dare transformed into a white doe. Sometimes it produces fraud, like the inscriptions on stone. Both speak to the same desire, to know what happened, to give shape to silence. Today, the Dare stones still exist, stored at Roanoke University, objects of curiosity rather than reverence. Scholars visit them not for their historical truth but for their cultural significance. They are artifacts not of the 16th century, but of the 20th, testaments to the way history's mysteries can inspire invention as well as investigation. They remind us that the lost colony is not only a question about the past, but a mirror of the present, reflecting each generation's needs and fantasies. For Eleanor Dare, the stones offered a ghostly afterlife. In the hoaxer's hands, she became not just a mother who vanished into silence, but a chronicler of her own fate, a woman who left behind words of sorrow and endurance. That false voice still resonates, a fabrication that nevertheless captures the longing of millions who wish she had spoken. The Dare stones are a lie, but they are also a testament to the enduring power of her story, and so the great hoax became part of the Roanoke legend. Not a solution, but a chapter. Not a revelation, but a reminder. In seeking answers, we must always guard against the temptation to believe too easily, to accept what fits our hopes rather than what withstands scrutiny. The lost colony's silence remains, unbroken by stone, but enriched by the lessons of how far we will go to fill it. The colony at Roanoke may have vanished in the 1580s, but in some sense, it never disappeared at all. Its traces lived on not only in the soil and in scattered artifacts, but in memory, imagination, and invention. Over the centuries, the lost colony has become as much a story of myth as of history. It has appeared in ballads, novels, plays, and pageants, retold for audiences who shaped its meaning to fit their own time. In this way, Roanoke has survived not as a fixed truth, but as an evolving legend, one that reflects the anxieties and aspirations of America itself. From the beginning, Virginia Dare became the central figure of this mythology. The first English child born in the New World was remembered not simply as an infant in 1587, but as a symbol of beginnings, innocence, and loss. In the 17th and 18th centuries, references to her appeared in passing, often as a footnote in the larger story of English colonization. But by the 19th century, she had become a romantic heroine of folklore. Writers crafted tales in which she survived, grew to womanhood, and was either destroyed by or absorbed into the native world. One of the most enduring legends cast Virginia Dare as a maiden, transformed into a white doe. According to this tale, she grew up among native peoples, but never lost her English essence. A jealous sorcerer, or in some versions a rejected lover, enchanted her, turning her into a deer that roamed the forests near Roanoke. Hunters sometimes glimpsed her, her eyes still human, her form ethereal. She became a symbol of unattainable beauty, of the lost potential of the colony itself. The legend combined elements of European fairy tale and native lore, projecting onto Virginia a tragic destiny that mirrored the disappearance of her people. Literature of the 19th century seized on Roanoke with enthusiasm. Novelists and poets romanticized the mystery, framing it as a parable of loss and longing. Cornelia Toothill's Virginia Dare, or The Lost Colony, 1840, imagined her as a heroine navigating the perils of wilderness and love. Later writers wove her into patriotic narratives, seeing in her not only tragedy, but the first seed of American identity. By embodying both hope and loss, Virginia Dare became an icon around which broader themes of destiny, purity, and nationhood were spun. This period also saw the rise of the lost colony as a regional identity marker, particularly in North Carolina. Local pride embraced the story, claiming Roanoke as the birthplace of English America. Monuments were erected, counties and schools were named for Virginia Dare, and the legend became part of civic heritage. In the 1930s, playwright Paul Green wrote The Lost Colony, a symphonic outdoor drama that premiered on Roanoke Island in 1937. Performed every summer since, it remains one of the longest-running plays in American history. Generations of tourists have sat beneath the stars watching the story reenacted. The colonists' hopes and sorrows played out against the backdrop of the very land where it occurred. In this ritual of performance, history became theatre, and theatre became tradition. The myth also seeped into American popular culture in subtler ways. The name Croatoan, carved on the tree, became a symbol of vanishing, appearing in ghost stories, novels, and even graffiti. Writers like Ambrose Bierce and Stephen King used it as a cipher for disappearance. The word itself carried an aura of the uncanny, as if the letters on the tree had absorbed some supernatural charge. In modern horror and science fiction, Croatoan recurs as shorthand for mysteries unsolved, for people gone without trace. The Lost Colony became not only a historical puzzle, but a cultural metaphor for absence. In the 20th century, Virginia Dare's image was repurposed in unexpected ways. She appeared on labels of wines, in advertisements, even in political rhetoric. Her name was invoked as a symbol of purity and heritage, often twisted into racialized narratives about who belonged in America. These uses reveal the darker side of myth, how a figure of innocence could be appropriated to serve exclusionary ideals. In this form, Virginia Dare became less a child of history than a cultural emblem molded to fit the prejudices of later eras. Yet the Lost Colony has also inspired creative works that emphasize ambiguity and resilience. Novels, operas, and films have reimagined the colonists' fate in countless ways: assimilation, annihilation, survival, transformation. Each retelling reflects the preoccupations of its moment. In times of optimism, the colonists find new life among friendly tribes. In times of fear, they are massacred or cursed. In times of romantic nostalgia, Virginia Dare walks as the white doe. The mystery's power lies precisely in its openness, in the way it invites projection and reinvention. Modern television and film continue the tradition. The Lost Colony has appeared in docudramas, horror series, and speculative fiction. Episodes of American Horror Story, Supernatural, and Sleepy Hollow have invoked Croatoan as a sign of doom. Documentaries revisit the archaeological search, blending fact with dramatization. In these portrayals, Roanoke often stands less as a historical event than as a cultural touchstone, shorthand for the unknowable. The colony is remembered not for its daily life, but for its disappearance, its silence turned into spectacle. At the same time, the mystery fuels tourism and local identity. Roanoke Island hosts museums, exhibits, and the long-running play. Visitors walk the reconstructed earthworks of Fort Raleigh, gaze at exhibits of John White's watercolors, and contemplate the word Croatoan etched into stone monuments. For locals, the Lost Colony is both heritage and industry, a story that binds community identity to national myth. What unites all these retellings, whether in folklore, literature, theatre, or media, is the transformation of Roanoke from a failed colony into a living legend. The colonists may have perished, assimilated, or scattered, but their story has endured precisely because it was never finished. Each generation, faced with its own uncertainties, has found in the Lost Colony a mirror of its anxieties and dreams. For Americans, the myth resonates on multiple levels. It is a story of beginnings, the first English child, the first settlement, the first mystery, it is also a story of loss, a reminder that ambition does not always succeed, that empire has its casualties. And it is a story of transformation, of how history becomes folklore, folklore becomes performance, and performance becomes identity. The Lost Colony endures not because of what happened in 1587, but because of what we imagine happened, what we wish or fear might have happened. In this way, Roanoke stands alongside other great unsolved mysteries: Atlantis, the vanished Norse of Greenland, the Marie Celeste. But unlike those, it belongs uniquely to America, woven into its earliest colonial narrative, inseparable from the birth of the nation. Its mythic status ensures that even if archaeology one day uncovers definitive answers, the legend will live on, larger than the facts. The colonists came seeking permanence, but found only disappearance. In myth, however, they achieved a different kind of permanence. They became characters in an enduring story, one told not only on their own island, but across the cultural landscape of a nation that claims them as its first mystery. The disappearance of the Roanoke colonists has never been just a question of where they went. From the moment John White found the carved word Croatoan, the story became something larger, something that outlived the settlers themselves. More than 4 centuries later, their fate is still debated in classrooms, dramatized on stages, and argued over in scholarly journals. What makes Roanoke endure is not only the mystery itself, but what that mystery has come to represent for those who keep retelling it. At its heart, Roanoke is about the fragility of beginnings. The colony was England's first attempt to plant families, not soldiers, on the soil of the New World. It was meant to be a seed of permanence, a community that would grow into a larger settlement. Its disappearance reminds us that empire is never inevitable. Dreams of conquest and settlement can vanish as quickly as they arise, undone by hunger, miscalculation, and the unpredictability of human alliances. In this sense, Roanoke is a story of failure that makes the later survival of Jamestown and Plymouth seem all the more improbable. The enduring power of the mystery also lies in its openness. Unlike Jamestown, which left skeletons, ruins, and records of grim survival, Roanoke left almost nothing. A carved word, a few scattered artifacts, and silence. That silence is what gives the story its staying power. Because there is no definitive ending, every generation has been free to imagine one. For some, the colonists assimilated, creating a tale of cultural blending. For others, they were slaughtered, turning the story into a parable of violence. For still others, they scattered inland and survived in anonymity. Each theory reveals less about the past than about the fears and hopes of those who propose it. Today, the mystery continues to fuel archaeological research. Excavations on Hatteras Island and at Site X in Bertie County search for fragments that might connect the colonists to native communities. Each discovery, whether a shard of pottery or a copper aglet, makes headlines because it promises to move the story forward. Yet archaeology has also shown how elusive certainty can be. The soil of the Outer Banks shifts with storms, artifacts are scattered by trade, and context is easily blurred. Roanoke resists being pinned down. For every piece of evidence unearthed, debate follows. The mystery remains intact, sustained not only by what has been lost, but by what can never be proven. Beyond archaeology, Roanoke endures in the stories communities tell about themselves. On Roanoke Island, the outdoor drama The Lost Colony still plays every summer, linking locals and visitors to the legend in ritual performance. The actors change, the audience changes, but the narrative remains, binding the island to its past. For North Carolina, the lost colony is heritage, a symbol of the state's place in the larger American story. Virginia Dare's name graces counties, schools, and organizations, her brief life elevated into a marker of beginnings. In American culture more broadly, the lost colony functions as a metaphor. It is invoked in discussions of uncertainty, of projects that fail, of ambitions undone by forces beyond control. Croatoan, the carved word, has become shorthand for disappearance in novels, films, and television. The colony's silence speaks not just to historians, but to anyone who has faced the unknown. It is a story that resonates because it is unfinished, and in its unfinishedness, it mirrors the uncertainties of life itself. There is also a darker resonance. For some, Roanoke has become a symbol of innocence lost, of European settlers swallowed by a world they could not control. Yet for others, it is remembered as part of the larger story of colonization, a prelude to the conflicts and displacements that would devastate native peoples in the centuries that followed. In this light, the lost colony is less a mystery to be solved than a reminder of cultural collision, of how European ambitions intersected with indigenous lives. The colonists may have vanished, but the story of colonization that followed was far from silent. Modern uses of the myth reveal its flexibility. In some contexts, Virginia Dare is celebrated as a symbol of American birth and endurance. In others, she has been appropriated in ways that distort her image into exclusionary rhetoric. That her name can carry such different meanings shows how myths evolve, how symbols are claimed and reshaped to serve different agendas. Roanoke itself becomes not only a historical mystery, but a cultural battleground over identity, belonging, and the stories we choose to tell. What Roanoke means today, then, is layered. It is a mystery that continues to inspire scientific research, a legend that fuels literature and entertainment, a heritage that shapes local pride, and a symbol that reflects national anxieties. Its endurance lies in the fact that it is not one story, but many. For archaeologists, it is a puzzle in soil. For writers, it is a canvas of possibility. For communities, it is an inheritance. For the curious, it is an enigma that invites endless speculation. Even if one day definitive evidence were found, if a document or a site proved beyond doubt that the colonists joined the Croatan or perished in battle, the mystery would not end. By then, Roanoke's cultural meaning has grown too large to be contained by facts. The legend has outpaced history. It has become a parable about uncertainty, about the fragility of human ventures, about the ways in which absence itself can be more powerful than presence. John White left Roanoke in 1587 with promises to return. He returned in 1590 to find silence. That silence has echoed ever since. Each attempt to fill it, whether with hoaxes like the Dare Stones, with folklore like the White Doe, or with archaeology like Site X, has only deepened the resonance of the story. The lost colony is no longer only about the colonists themselves. It is about how we remember, how we imagine, how we search for meaning in the gaps history leaves behind. What Roanoke means today is not closure, but continuation. It is a story that refuses to end, that keeps inviting us back to the shores of the Outer Banks, to the word carved on a tree, to the possibility of answers just beyond reach. In its persistence, it has become America's oldest unsolved mystery, not because it cannot be solved, but because it continues to live most fully in the space between history and imagination,